Please join me in saying the chalice lighting words as Philip helps us to light the chalice this morning. We light this chalice with the embers of compassion. We light this chalice with the torch of justice. We light this chalice with the radiance of joy.
And now we have our story, and you're going to be an important part. So at the end of the story, there's a happy ending, and you all have to yell, "Hurrah, hurrah." Do you want to practice? Hurrah, hurrah. And you older children out there might want to join in also. Okay? You want to practice? Hurrah, hurrah, whoever you are. Okay, our story is from a book about Just a Little Bit by Anne Taubert. One day, an elephant and mouse were in the park. Elephant said, "Let's try the seesaw." Elephant sat down on one side of the seesaw, and Mouse had to climb up to the very edge of the top. But nothing happened. Elephant said, push down," but nothing still happened. Along came Giraffe and Zebra, who said, "You need a little bit more help." They climbed on with Mouse, but again, nothing happened. Elephant stayed on the ground. Mouse was still in the air. Then Lion and Bear ran up and said, "Let's see what we can do." And they jumped on, and everyone together now was urged by Elephant to push down. All grunted and groaned and pushed down, but nothing happened. Other friends joined to help. Crocodile, mongoose, monkey, and ostrich climbed on. And the results was, "Oh no," moaned the crowd. "He'll never get off the ground." And the elephant urged again to push down and push down. Someone in the crowd said, "They'll never do it. Let's go." But then as they were about to give up, when out of the sky flew a small brown beetle and landed on Mouse's head. And guess what? Down to the ground went Mouse and the rest of the animals. Elephant said, "Every little bit helps." All in the crowd shouted, "Hurrah! Hurrah!" So what does this story tell us about what you can do when you're having difficulties? You have friends. But what about small friends? Those who can only do a little bit. But every little bit helps. So join in.
You shall go out with joy and be led forth with peace. The mountains and the hills will break forth before you. There'll be shouts of joy and all the trees of the field shall clap.
As Karen mentioned earlier, throughout the month of June, we will be discussing spiritual growth. And I feel like somehow an explanation is in order as to what spirit is. So the question is out there of what is spirit in a Unitarian Universalist world? Well, I don't know what it would be, but for the world according to Reverend Jonathan anyway, this is how I take a look at spirit. First of all, I take a look at what spirit is not for me. I tend to be one of those thinking people who kind of try to come at it from a more rational perspective of what spirit may be for me. And somehow or another, I don't know if you've seen any of those cartoons or TV shows where spirit is somehow seen as a more translucent version of somebody. For example, Betty's spirit is that which I could almost see through. So I could see through Betty and see Leslie behind her somehow, because that's what the spirit is. So as we can tell, spirit, in order to get to its definition, sometimes we have to peel away, like an onion, the layers of what I call the woohoo factor. Ever find that to be the case in your life too? That just sounds way too out there and way too woohoo for me to buy into it. So this morning, I'd like us to take a look at what spirit is and what spirituality means for us as Unitarian Universalists, right? And what do I mean when I'm talking about spiritual growth? How do I define those who have achieved a certain amount of spiritual greatness in their lives? Is it due to the fact that they're able to walk on charcoal without getting burned? Or is it due to the fact that they're able to handle snakes like cobras? I know we don't have any in Hawaii, supposedly. But, what does it mean to be spiritual? Or does it mean that when you look at someone, suddenly you see them floating up into the air and they're being carried by a cloud, levitating somehow? Or is it even what Karen does, which is stay 2 inches, at least 2 inches off the ground all the time? Is that our definition of what it means to be spiritually uplifted? And oftentimes, I think, especially as we grow older, we tend to think of spirituality as these great accomplishments. I think, for example, the fact that this congregation has just turned 60, on the need for this congregation to somehow reevaluate the kind of spiritual impact we have had in our community. And so, according to American culture anyway, we're supposed to use superlatives. Isn't it always about the biggest, the grandest, the greatest achievement and accomplishment that we've ever had? Isn't that how we measure, quote unquote, success? Maybe. And this is precisely the question that I came up with for my spiritual director. Because I told him, you know what? I am going through a spiritual crisis in my life right now. This was a couple months ago, so I was saying, I'm about to turn 37 in a month. So I'm questioning what value I have brought forth in the world. What kind of spiritual life am I leading? So can you recommend some books for me, perhaps, that I could mull over and engage with so that I know what it means to have a midlife crisis? Because quite frankly, I can't afford a Ferrari right now. And where would I drive it anyway? I can't go fast anywhere on this island. So, I don't know if I'm about to have an affair with somebody else or not, but I don't know what kind of midlife crisis I ought to have at 37. So, you know what he did? He recommended this great book for me by Richard Rohr called Falling Upward, A Spirituality for the Two Halves of Life. I found the title quite intriguing because I'm usually drawn to paradoxes naturally anyway. And I thought to myself, that is so counterintuitive. What does it mean to fall upward? Because when we talk about falling, we usually mean falling on the ground. But Richard Rohr says that the way up is sometimes via the way down. So what does that mean, really? Let me give you 3 examples. One is what happened when I was just beginning to come out back in high school. And as many of you know, I actually attended a very conservative, fundamentalist, evangelical Christian church growing up. And in that tradition, we were taught that being gay is a sin and that it's immoral and that gay people were going to go to hell. And so I struggled because I love my spiritual life so much. And I had such a great relationship with the divine that for me to have to choose between my sexuality and my spirituality was the difficult thing for me to do. And so, in the midst of that struggle, I actually became quite depressed. And I could even tell you moments when I thought about taking my own life. and moments when I thought that I would end it right here and right now. However, let me tell you about a couple of things that actually saved my life. One was I had this spiritual practice. I didn't call it that at the time. But I would pick out the most depressing movies I could ever think of and pop it in the VHS player. Yes, I am dating myself. And yes, you've probably seen these devices in museums. They're little tapes, that are rectangular. Yeah, some of you have seen it. Anyway, guess what those two movies are? And I know you may have your own top 10 list. Beaches. Oh. Thank you, Dennis. And the other one was Joy Luck Club. So they're definitely what I would call two razors up kind of movies. They are so depressing that it definitely would want to make you slit your wrists. I don't know how many have seen those two movies or not. But my rationale and my thinking is if I get so depressed and I get so down, I have nowhere left to go but up. Sounds good to you, doesn't it? I don't know, it sounds good to me. But that was my thinking. And it really worked for me for a while. The idea that somehow I need to fall into my feelings and fall to the depth of who I really am in order for me to question everything around me. And so out of that depth, I was able to find such a spiritual upliftedness and a spiritual transformation in my life, to a point where I could now define spirituality. So now that I've told you what I don't define it as, what I do define it as is probably closer to what Church of the Larger Fellowship defines it as. It defines it as the quest for meaning. In fact, if you go to questformeaning.org, you'll run into Church of the Larger Fellowship's website. So quest for meaning as one definition for spirituality. And the other one is to experience the ground of being in the here and the now. I don't know how many of you during the meditation segment of our service felt that. I'm not asking you if you thought about spirituality at that time, but how many of you experienced the ground of being lifting you up, supporting you, embracing you in those great big arms of love? The earth uplifting you and nourishing you. How many of you felt that during the meditation? How do you get a show of hands? Well, sure. All right, fine. Tough crowd here. But anyway, other people have, believe it or not. And the comment I've been getting more and more about our 9:15 a.m. service, and this is a great plug for it, is that it's such a spiritually invigorating and re-energizing kind of service, because we do have moments in there where we insert intentional reflection and pause, and a way for us to get away from the busy lives that we normally live. That here in that environment is a container for safety to explore our spirituality. Okay, so that's one way that I have experienced falling down in order to get up. And isn't it interesting too that, that according to Richard Rohr anyway, that it takes falling flat on your okole in order to wake you up and in order for you to realize what up means, instead of just going from mountaintop to mountaintop to mountaintop. Any of you know how to ride a bike? All right, a good number of you. Any of you recall how you learned to ride a bike? Did it take a few falling on your okole moments? Yeah, right? So isn't that interesting that the way you learn how to fall is by falling? Right. And that by falling, you experience what balance seems like in your life. And so what would it mean for us in a similar manner, spiritually speaking, if we allowed ourselves to fall, and if we allowed ourselves to actually be in touch with that ground of being? Can we find a sense of learning there? Can we find freedom there? Can we find grace in the midst of the fall? Another example I have is, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, because oftentimes in these settings, We call it anonymous, so we won't ask for names. But in recovery groups, there's a whole idea that before you could even engage in the 12-step process, that you need to do what? Hit rock bottom. Yeah, you need to somehow come to a place where you feel absolutely helpless, and you're just there in a mess, saying, gosh, now that I've fallen down, I have nowhere else to go but up. And that's when you realize and begin to work through the steps, beginning with the first one of, I am really powerless against this addiction that I have. And so another great example of what it means to fall down flat before we can even rebuild again to get up to where we want to be. And as Unitarian Universalists, I think we've often been accused of the people who are who want to just kind of find a shortcut. Can we find a shortcut to the spiritual growth thing? Can we take some spiritual growth hormones so that we don't have to go through the tough parts, we don't have to go through that depressing part of our lives? Can we just skip the suffering and go straight to the success? Yet, I'd like to ask us, how many in this world, again, show of hands, how many of you have not experienced a failure or a falling or a sorrow in your life ever? Wow. Just for the record on the camera, no hands went up. That's interesting. So suffering and failure and falling is the great equalizer. All of us have gone through it. The difference is, how does one pick oneself back up again? And for the answer to that, I invite you to come back next week. Tune in next week for the next episode of Spiritual Growth. How's that for a hook? And again, what Richard Rohr tells us in his book is that before the truth can set you free, it makes you miserable. Before the truth can set you free, it first makes you miserable. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. And when you do encounter those moments, I would hope that this community would be able to embrace you. You know, going back to that song, Come, Come, Whoever You Are, that this sanctuary, the First Unitarian Church of Honolulu, is that incubator for your spiritual growth. That here we don't necessarily try to find a pat answer to give to you, and we don't necessarily have, like I mentioned before, a growth hormone to give to you and prescribe to you and say, just pop one of these pills a day, and boom, you'll experience a miraculous growth. But here in this place, we can say that you are welcome here, and that we'll walk with you, no matter what your spiritual issues are, or wherever you are on your journey. Because all we have is the here and the now to be with one another. So if you agree with that, I'd like you to say amen. Amen. May it be so.